Well, hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Dave Vaughan, and I'm the founder of Plant a Million Corals Foundation. And I know what all of you are thinking. First, you didn't know I was a mind reader. So actually, I'm reading your minds that you're thinking corals grow very, very slow. And this guy looks like he's 100 years old. So how is he going to plant a million corals? Well, I'm going to show you how that is done by a new technique that now is called micro-fragmentation. We can now grow corals much faster and many more in number than ever before. It literally is a game changer for corals. And why is that important? Well, because corals are probably the #1 and #2 species, along with, I believe, is the poor polar bear, that are recipients of what climate change is doing to them. Yes, they actually have been hurt bad, but because they are underwater, they're not as easily observed. They are more hidden for what is taking place with just a small amount of temperature change. And so we're going to have my friend Ty Pennington actually tell us a little bit about what this technology is. And then I'm going to come back on with a PowerPoint and discuss why corals are important to climate change and why there's a game changer of something we can do now that gives us hope. And then at the end, we'll have some time for live questions and answers. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and introduce you to Ty Pennington, who basically was down to see us just last year.
Coral reefs provide habitat for marine life, protection for our coastlines, and they're responsible for much of the oxygen we need to survive. But as climate change dramatically alters ocean temperatures, coral reefs are dying off at a massive rate. In the Florida Keys, Dr. David Vaughan has infused hope into the daunting task of replanting coral reefs through a process called microfragmentation.
We used to take a coral this big and make 2. Now we take a coral this big and make 20 to 100 corals. And in 6 months, they're all ready to plant again.
Well, I think it's really important too to really understand that this is it's a kind of a huge breakthrough. So in layman's terms, explain to me what's really happening with what you're doing with a coral.
It's basically cutting them into little pieces, stimulates them to grow very fast and in large numbers. Something happens to the coral to trigger it to grow faster if it's been hurt, just like your skin. Your skin doesn't grow fast unless you fall down and break some of the skin, and your skin quickly grows over and heals over in just weeks.
In order to accelerate how much new coral could be grown, Dr. Vaughan developed a mobile lab system that could function anywhere in the world. What does it take to get a lab like this built?
Well, most people think about something as high tech as being in a university or a government agency and will cost millions of dollars. This is really now down to a farmer level. This is a fraction of the cost. And so literally we can produce 1,000 corals in every one of these tanks twice a year.
Wow, that's phenomenal. That's a lot of life for the ocean to be created right here. Well, it's one thing to hear about this, but it's another to actually go out and experience the reef, well, up close and personal. Today's mission is simple. Go out to an area of reef that Dr. Dave has been planting new corals he grew from microfragmentation.
People restore houses like, why not restore reefs?
It'll give me a chance to better understand how he hopes to plant a million corals. Well, we're here.
Yeah, we ready to get wet?
Let's dive in.
Come on, let's go.
Dr. Dave has brought me to a site where a ton of coral has died off. But rather than try to replace these large structures, he's planting his new coral on top of the existing ones. One of his other breakthroughs came with how the microfragments work together. Typically, corals compete for space, But because these new corals all come from the same DNA, they will actually connect and thrive, growing faster atop the dead skeleton. So far, it's been an incredible success and one that gives hope for the future. So what happens if we don't save the coral reefs?
The cost is really us. It's a functioning coral reef, it's a functioning fisheries, it's a functioning production of oxygen, it's stopping our ability to live by the coastline, and eventually the demise of our oceans.
This particular coral you're talking about, it can thrive in other areas besides just Florida?
Well, we've tested this on both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and it works with the massive species in both oceans. And so the good news is we'd be growing Florida corals for Florida, Caribbean corals for Caribbean, and the Pacific corals for the Pacific.
That's amazing. So that's your dream. That's what you'd like to see happen now.
We have a solution and a package of a unit that can go to places, show people how to start up and start their own coral farm.
So what do you need to make that happen?
We need financial support to teach them this technology and let them continue their own. If I say I can grow a few corals, that's fine. If I can grow a few 100,000, that's even better. If I can grow 1 million, that sounds like a big task, but it's actually just a good first step. If I can show people around the world how they can grow 100,000 and they can grow 1 million, and before you know it, we're making a big influence on a giant ocean.
Well, this is Dr. Dave Vaughan, back to you again. And thanks to my friend Ty Pennington. Most of you know the work he does of restoring houses, but there's no reason now we can't restore reefs. So I'm going to give you a little tour of just exactly how we do that, and then give you a chance to ask some questions. If during my presentation you want to list and type in a question, do so in the chat area, and then at the end, I'll make sure I'll try to get to your question to answer it. Okay, I've said I'm going to plant 1 million corals before I retire, and most of you saw that how old I look, but this is potential to actually do so. And so we literally could do 1 million corals in a location in just a couple of years. But why would we do that? Well, we know that in the past, the reefs flourished in all the tropical areas of the sea. But we now know that climate change is the biggest factor. There are a lot of stressors on coral reefs, including things like overfishing, nearshore nutrients, the ability for too many people in one area, sediments from land and runoff. But the largest one of all is climate change. Just a very small increase in temperatures can mean devastation to a coral reef. And why do we care about these pretty things? Well, they're pretty to look at, but they're also responsible for, even though they're a small, less than 1% of the ocean, they're actually responsible for 25 to 40% of our world's fisheries. If we lose our reefs, we will lose that much of our fisheries. In fact, there's over 700 million people on this planet that actually depend on the fish they catch every day from a coral reef to feed themselves and their family. If we lose our reefs, we're going to have to figure out how to feed another almost 1 billion people on our planet. And tourism. Let's not overlook the value in jobs. Thousands of jobs in Florida alone. Actually, Monroe County, the Florida Keys, almost $1 billion worth of the economy. In South Florida, including Miami, Dade, Broward, Fort Lauderdale area, West Palm Beach area, and the Keys, its value is $5 billion. Same as the Great Barrier Reef, $5 billion. Same as the state of Hawaii, $5 billion. So we've got something that literally drives our economy. Why would we want to lose it? Why wouldn't we want to restore it like we used to restore forests? One thing that was just recently overshadowed was the procedure that the reef does for us. We have so many people in Florida, especially South Florida, that live within just a short distance of the coast. Our past few hurricanes, from Andrew to the numerous ones we've had recently. The recent one in the Florida Keys 3 years ago was just literally 38-foot waves offshore of the Florida Keys, as reported by the NOAA buoys. However, we have a 5 mile away coral reef, barrier reef, and we have 5 miles of patch reefs that broke those 38-foot waves down to by the time they got to our Keys where we live, just 4 to 8 foot waves and surge. If we hadn't had that coral reef there, there wouldn't be one structure in the Florida Keys still standing. There are many other things that in my TED Talk, people have talked about, the oxygen they produce as well. We know that 60 to 70% of all the oxygen in the ocean is what produced in the planet is produced by the ocean, and corals or the algae within them, as well as the seaweeds and phytoplankton and others, is what produces that. Many of you, if you were my age, see what climate change has been doing if you can get underwater and actually see it firsthand. The picture on the left is a picture that was about 10 years ago in an area that I'm going to show you later, that just now in the past few years has looked like what you see on the right. Most of the staghorn and elkhorn gone, most of the fish not there. Remember that most of the world now is seeing critical changes like this. If you haven't seen what it was when snorkeling 20 or 30 years ago, you're going to be deathly surprised. So what I'm going to do is move on to show you some of the good news, not just the downside. And I'm going to do that by wanting you to try to remember this exact picture, the before on the left, how beautiful it was, greater than 10 years ago, and the one on the right, which looked terrible. And at the end, I'm going to show you after restoration what it looks like today. Well, what can really be done? There's really comes down to about three things, are all good. We can protect more areas. We can improve water quality. And we can hopefully improve environmental conditions like climate conditions by lowering the CO2. But if we wait till that is complete before we start, it will be very, very difficult. Restoring living corals, we can use nurseries. And there are half of the corals still alive that are resistant to normal conditions. And it's a condition where we can now start to grow corals. Let's look at a coral nursery. A coral nursery is one where you actually can take a small piece of a coral and actually cut it into, break it into a small piece or fragment and grow it on a platform on something that actually is one that will support it and grow lots of them. And that was the early stages with staghorn coral. And it's one that was very easy to set up, and people did it in the field. This is Zach from Chasing Corals, who saw some of our corals here in the Florida Keys and saw that now that's what we're doing. Okay, I seem to be having a trouble to share my screen. And get to a point where we can start this PowerPoint again from the beginning, or from one of the early so I'm going to see if my assistant Dee Dee can show that PowerPoint and actually take control of that screen.
I can do that. What PowerPoint number would you like?
Where we left off.
You got it.
Okay, can you put it on presentation mode? Okay, how about way younger than that? About 10 slides earlier. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, stop. Okay, sorry about everybody. And now move forward. Move forward again. Okay, so one more. What can be done is we can grow corals. This is what the staghorn coral looks like. Let's look at the next slide. This is what the underwater nurseries can look like growing trees. Next. So let's look at a quick sequence. From the nursery, we can plant corals about the size of a few of your fingers, like shown here. This is May 2013. Next slide. June, they start to grow and branch. Next slide. October, they are forming a small thicket. Next slide. December, a bunch of habitat is actually created with fish, you can see. Next slide. And about 1 year later, an entire thicket. That's fast for the fast branching growing coral. Next slide. However, that is fast growth, but these are fast growing, but also fast leaving corals. And sometimes in more than 5 years, they will have broken and fragmented moves in another location, not on their own, but by storms. Next slide. But the major part of the reefs are built by what we call the massive corals, like the elkhorn, like the boulder coral, like the mountain coral, like some of those that you may have remembered. This is what masses the whole habitat of the reef and protects our coastline from storms. And everybody had forgotten these. Next. So in working with the slow growing corals, I started to work on how they reproduce sexually rather than breaking them asexually. Next. And once a year, they actually reproduce underwater by spawning. Next. They release gametes, occurs in one night in the middle of the summer. It's a wonderful event. Next. And it coincides with the lunar cycle. Next. But there's very small larvae and eggs. And next, literally, they produce a swimming larvae that finds a place to settle back down. Next. And only 1 out of 1 million makes it That sounds crazy until you hear the second part. That usually only happens 1 out of a million, maybe once every 10, 25, or 100 years. Crazy, because corals can live hundreds of years old, so they only need to be successful in making one more, maybe every decade or every century. Our first test tube babies in the laboratory looked like something you could only see under the microscope, and only got to the huge size of a head of a pin in about a year to a half a year. Next. Well, a few of these elkhorn corals that are massive got to a small coin size in 1 year. Next. And by 3 years old was only the size of a large coin. I took it off the upper shelf of the aquarium and put it on the bottom shelf and forgot about it. Next. So I forgot about it, but I went to go pull it. And when I pulled it, it broke into tiny pieces. I thought it was going to die, but instead of dying, that's not what happened. It actually grew faster than ever before. And the small little fragments, the size of a head of a pin, grew up to the coin size in just weeks instead of months. And being a good scientist, I took the accident and a scalpel and tried it again. And it worked every time and with every single massive species. So now we have 2 ways to do things. We can take a large fragment, next, and we can use a big saw and cut it into something the size of a golf ball. And we can wait 2 to 3 years, next, and we can wait till it gets up to size and then plant it. Next. And it takes years. Now we take a very fine diamond bandsaw, which is made to make coral jewelry like earrings out of stone of the skeleton, but we use it to cut both the skeleton and the live tissue into tiny fragments, some as little as a couple of millimeters in size. So by producing 20 to 100 pieces, we not only just get 1 or 2, but we get as many as 100, but it also stimulates them to grow real fast. Next. So what we see here is that we can produce 1,000 coral pieces in just 1 day. And what we can do is then they grow up to that size in just a few months instead of years. And we can plant them if we have enough room and time to handle them all. Next. And in just a half a year, they're ready to plant 1,000 of them. So you get 2 crops a year out of the small water table or tank. Next. So what started in the early years at Moat Marine Lab, when we started doing this the old fashioned way, is we'd get a couple hundred in a year, and now we can get a couple thousand in a year, and now we can get 1,000 in a day. Next. And so after just a few years, we were producing 25,000 corals and planting 10. Now we're holding 50,000 or the capacity to, and can plant even more. Next. So here's the sequence. Quickly cut a piece into hundreds of, and if you have 10 or 100 into thousands of pieces like you see on the left-hand side, but within 6 months they start growing and are ready to plant. If you're not ready to plant, they start overgrowing each other. And we discovered that most corals do not like to touch each other because they'll fight because of being overgrown, except on the picture on the right, you'll see that center area. Actually, right now, they're not only touching, they're not fighting, they're actually fusing together, or what we call reskinning. Next. So this happens pretty fast. These are cement discs the size of a baseball, and 4 little chips of the big elkhorn coral on the upper left. And each picture is a picture 1 week later. So if you go from the left to the right, you'll see that they're starting to grow. From the middle row, they're starting to grow together and touching each other. And the lower row, they're not only touching each other, they're fusing together. This is just 11 weeks. taking something of a small piece and actually producing something that would have taken close to 3 to 4 years to grow in the wild. This is amazing. Next. So we can produce large numbers. Next. And it's really just up to us. We can fuse them back together. Next. And it's called reskinning. So we can take a dead coral head like you see on the lower left, and regretfully half the coral heads are just skeletons now. And we can put, let's say, 10 or 20 of the same corals that came from the same single piece or clones and distribute them on that coral and let them start to grow out. And because they're from the same clone, they reach each other, they reskin together. And next slides will show you what this looks like in the water. So this is the sequence, and even the brain coral, all of the grooves and the valleys grow to get back together. Next. So we'll take a dead coral head, and as you see here, put 7 or 8 pieces the size of maybe a basketball, or 20 pieces the size of a large pizza. And then we'll let them grow together on the surface. And we are literally bringing a many-year-old coral dead skeletons back to life by just transplanting new live tissue on the surface. Next. So this is something the size of a small automobile, and with 200 to 300 pieces on there, it will grow together in less than 5 years and really bring back to life a 1/4 century-year-old coral head. Next. And this is a very, very large coral head. Many of you have seen these. This is about 12 feet tall and 15-foot diameter. And by putting about 800 pieces of this coral, you can literally bring a 1,000-year-old coral back to life in just a few years, not have to start from scratch. Next. Now, this sounds unheard of. I mean, if you talk to me at a cocktail hour and I said, I can bring a century-year-old coral back to life, you would wondering what cocktail I was actually drinking at that party. But we can literally do this. So it's a game changer for corals. Next. Now, we've also done some good changes in sexual reproduction. From those first time of getting about 11 to now being able to get a few thousand, we not only just make clones of coral from the same gene as their parent piece, but we produce new genetic diversity by sexual reproduction and the successful settlement now that I'm sure in the future will be even much more successful. Next. We can also test some of these, like is done at Mote Marine Lab with this ocean acidification and temperature simulator. They can actually see how climate change is affecting corals by the temperature and the pH of the water. So we will know if some of these, and we're seeing resistant strains. The good news is we're seeing some genotypes being able to be either resistant and don't get the bleaching or disease, or resilient. Even if they bleach, they come back and bounce back. And that's what we want to find out and use those to make more of our more resistant reefs, just like you would in a forest. Next. So we can literally do some of these pieces by, selecting ones Mother Nature knows are good, and one attribute, and maybe another attribute. Let's say one is resistant to climate change, high temperatures, and the other one's resistant to ocean acidification. Cross the two together and see if we can get something that's both resistant to both, and do it in a short period of time. Next. So we can do this at scale. One tank can hold 800 to 1,000 corals. So if we just take half of them and we cut them, elkhorn can be cut into 40 to 100 pieces. Let's cut those 400 elkhorn coral pieces into 50, and we make 20,000 microfragments that in just 6 months are needed to either be planted or cut again. If we cut them again, 20,000 pieces into just 50, There's your 1 million. So you could literally get to 1 million corals in 1 year. I hope I make at least that long, and I hope all of us can do 1 million in future years and every year. Next. We could literally, with this scale, with the staghorn corals in the field nursery and the elkhorn corals in the land nursery, take these two endangered species off the endangered species list in a record period of time. What other organisms can you say you can do that with? And the only thing you need now is funding and support. Next. And not in thousands of years, but in our lifetime, even those of you that look gray like me. Next. So remember that picture that I showed you back then, where the second picture is actually now the one on the left-hand side. And this is a site that Fragments of Hope in Belize used. And that 10 years ago, they started to plant. And this, with my picture from about a year ago, is what that reef looks today. This looks like I did some magic hocus pocus of just switching the slides in the beginning and the end, but this is actually what it looks like. Next. So here's the picture and the documentation. Upper left, December 2010, just a couple pieces of corals there. 2011, those corals started to grow. And this is the picture of that same exact site in 2020. How many raises of hands out there want to see us do that to all the reefs in Florida and around the world? I've got my hand up. Next. So what we need to do is train people how this is done. This is a picture of me. It happens to be at Mote Marine Laboratories in the Florida Keys, showing a working group how this is done. Many people think, though, after seeing how great it is to do it, that it takes millions and millions of dollars to do this, but it doesn't. It doesn't if you make all the pieces and decisions and engineering all together for them. Next. Here's another picture, though, you can see. This is Hurricane Wilma, before Hurricane Wilma in Cancun, one of their iconic reefs. Next. This is what that reef looked like after Wilma. And I'm going to show you one more picture like that so you can get a good idea next what it actually looks like. It was literally a rubble zone the size of a football field. And with just less than 15,000 corals to start it, but over 10 years of allowing it to grow, this is what it looks like today. Not only did the elkhorn and the staghorn plant to grow, but other things started to grow too. Sponges, soft corals, and other species of hard corals actually knew and smelled a living reef and settled there themselves at one time. Next. So we're now making coral restoration units. These are transportable units that each can produce about 10,000 corals. We do the designing of the water system, the pumps, the filters, the valves, the aeration required, all the plumbing put together and then stacked and transported inside a shipping container. Literally a turnkey coral nursery in a box. It can go together in just one day at the arrival port and set up in less than 6 to 10 hours. And by day 2, you're pumping water and growing corals. Next. So these are affordable to scaling up to large scale, and they can be used for anything. They can be used for some research. They can be used for sexual reproduction and settlement, and they could even be used for, holding turtles or something like else with a tank next to it. And it can motivate a local community organization, get them up and running on some. And we're soon making some that could be even solar powered for off-grid. Next. So the good news about this is that even though corals is really like the polar bear, a poor example of what climate change can do to a species, or in this case, an ecosystem, but there is hope. So let's talk about talk about climate change? Well, we talk about 1.5 degrees C temperature increase, and most of us say, well, that's not too bad. I can't tell that difference. Most of you couldn't, but the corals can. And let's remember one thing, that's 1.5 degrees higher average. Now that could mean that in the winter, we have colder winters and hotter summers. So for instance, we could have a winter that averaged 10 degrees colder. And we could have a summer that averaged 11.5 degrees hotter. The difference between those two is just a 1.5 degree average, but it means that corals are outside their temperature tolerances. And if you go to a pet store and want to grow a coral in a reef tank, they would tell you keep it between, room temperature, 72 degrees to maybe 80 degrees. Don't go to 85 and never go to 90. And that's what we've done to our oceans. So it's not a surprise that just like the polar bears, the corals are in bad shape. And the good news is that if everybody learns of what's happening to the corals, and there is hope, that we will encourage them with the hope that they can take the challenge of stopping climate change in our lifetime so that we can grow more corals. You know, we can't wait until climate change is solved before we start, because if we do that, we'll literally be not only losing 20 or 30 species of corals, but we'll be losing hundreds of species of fish and thousands of species of invertebrates that will not come back after climate change is solved. You know, we have about 80 billion people on this planet, and at least half, and people say 60% believe that climate change is real. So let's look at that. We have over half of the 8 billion people knowing climate change is real and willing to do something about it. But we only have a couple hundred coral restoration people and willing to do something about it. So we don't want to wait till climate change is solved. We want those 4 to 8 billion people to help do it a little at a time by themselves, by making small changes. We don't want to wait for one world person to just say, let's stop it. We all have to take the world under our range and start making it happen, but also start growing the corals. So when it's back to normal, and hopefully not worse than it was, we have living corals and the organisms that rely on it to be able to do it. One of the things most people have seen with some of our conservationists is that people who have seen a picture of a poor polar bear with nothing to eat, you know, that one photograph by National Geographic, by Paul Micklin, showing a starving polar bear, really pushed and motivated a lot of people to say, this is real and we need to do something soon. But underwater with corals, people don't see them. Could you imagine if we had what's called coral bleaching on the land? And you woke up one morning, walked out of your house, and your yard, your flowers, and all the trees were not green anymore. They took stark white. And within a month, some of them made it back and grew new leaves, and some of them died. You'd say, this has got to stop. But that's what's happening underwater. We need people to know that corals are the canary in the coal mine, and we don't have much time, but there is hope. We do have a way to do this. We need to engage our youth, which need that vision of hope that there's not all bad news and can change this. Okay, that's my last slide, and hopefully I will open it up and be back on the screen to answer some questions. And thank you all for listening to that PowerPoint. Okay, so I know we have a number of potential questions, and I'm not going to stroll through them all. So I'm going to ask my co-presenter, Dee Dee, to see if there's any general questions that need to be answered here.
So one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A was from Christine Nichols. And it is, do the corals that break off and move due to storms rejuvenate themselves and create new reefs, or do they die?
That's a great question. And there's really only one species that happens with. We have 28 or 30 species of hard corals. We have one branching coral. It's called, the common name is the staghorn, because it looks like a deer's antlers. But like a deer's antlers, but made out of very fragile material, it can break in large storms. And this one has adopted to break in a large storm, and the piece can roll around. Now, regretfully, they don't all survive. If it rolls around in the mud or gets stuck in the sand, it will not survive. But if it rolls around in old reef or rock or crevices and can lodge itself, just like that little piece of coral that I learned that broke into tiny microfragments, they also can grow on top and attach themselves. And that's their main evolved way of reproduction. And it seems to be pretty good. And yes, other areas of the reef may show up that you've actually helped plant areas sort of like a tumbleweed in other areas or zone and not even know it. And thank you for that question.
A question from an anonymous attendee: how can people best support the efforts of PAMC to bring the coral container labs to local communities where they're needed?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. As I mentioned before, it doesn't take millions and millions of dollars to produce some of these, but even some countries and islands don't even have thousands of dollars. So the Plant a Million Corals Foundation is a 501c3 and is taking donations from people who would like to help support a container, either in a specific area or one that many of them can do together to go to a different area. For instance, you could get 5 dive groups to chip in and support one container and go to the island where they like the best. Then go to that island and actually volunteer and help them plant and see what they're doing. So there's ways to fund this that I think are fun. And there's ways to fund this that I think are connected to what everybody would love to see is an attraction and an eco-educational facility that is doing the right thing. So we're encouraging anybody receiving one of our transportable containers that they open up their facility to the public for hours where they can see exactly what they're doing. Not only are they going to get community involvement, but they're going to get volunteers and students that want to help out. And the more people that can learn about the plight of corals, the more people that can learn about stopping climate change in its tracks. And also, I think it's a potential that donations from people attending an eco attraction would or could be able to support financially the continued operations and costs of operating during the year, or maybe enough to maybe make another one and another one and another one. Thank you for that question.
We have another question from Thomas Risa. How have restored corals done in the face of heating events? And also, how are community members being educated on the broader ecosystem effects of our everyday decisions?
That's a great question. And it's a big topic. You know, we've seen lately that, you know, we thought that bleaching, which is caused by high temperatures, happened maybe once a century. Now we're seeing bleaching happen maybe once a decade. Now we're seeing bleaching sometimes happen once every couple of years. And the press has done a pretty good job of teaching the public what this bleaching actually is, what's caused by it, and how they can help. But there has been really no way of implementing a planting program on a large scale. We hope this is the first of a few that have started up around the oceans that are doing this exactly same thing, each a little differently, and each maybe tailored to their location and their community needs. But I think 2 things. One is we need to get these in many places so people know more about the whole effect on the ecosystem. This needs to be done in schools. This needs to be done in camps. This needs to be done in educational curriculums. And this needs to be done where everybody knows what's going on. If a coral restoration system is put in a place, I think they literally could get 10,000 visitors. And if 10,000 visitors each give a couple of dollars, then you probably have enough to operate. But you also now have 10,000 educated ecosystem people that will now do differently of turning their lights off when they don't need it, buy a better car that gets less gas, insist that at workplace or in their home lives, they are making the steps to help the corals and the poor polar bear and us have a better world like we had before.
That actually leads into another good question. How can we better engage youth in learning about corals in a way that engages them and doesn't lecture them?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think it's basically involvement. Instead of lecturing and just yelling, and as well as only giving the doomsday gloom and doom, you involve them into experiences that they can see firsthand. There hasn't been one person that has seen any of the corals that we've had in tanks that hasn't come away from that experience a changed person. So if the youth can be involved with things such as experience and service learning, and by volunteering and citizen science, and know that they're doing well, they'll know that not only do they feel much better for it, but it's something that will, start a spark in not just being excited about learning, but being excited about what we have and what we need to keep. So I think a full hands-on type experience of teaching kids, not just teaching them, but showing them how they can cut their own coral and make 10 more. How many kids could go back after school day and say, hey, Mom, I just made 10 corals. And next year I'm going to go back and see what they look like. And in 20 years, I'm going to bring my kids there to see it as well. So it could be a legacy rather than a lecture.
Next question, how bad is beach replenishment for our coral reefs, and how can we end this practice or do it in a more sustainable way?
Well, there's a lot of things that, that could change. I think, with now approaching 8 billion people, all trying to breathe, all trying to eat, all trying to have a piece of property and enjoy the natural resource, it's tough. We're going to have the kinds of things you saw as the other possibility. We need, things such as a marine protected area. We need management of sanctuaries. We need, a better way of having, the ability to conserve our resources ourselves. And, that starts with a single person doing that at home, but it doesn't end there. It ends to, include kids in your classroom, and it includes people at your workplace, and includes how you vote and how you ask your politicians or your government officials of what you'd like to see. And that would be including things such as whether beach nourishment has an alternative, or whether there's a better way to get food, and maybe not catch every single last one of them out there. Thank you for your question.
I have a question. Do you know of any ongoing coral restoration projects operating in Southeast Asia?
Yes, there are a few. There's a couple, at least a good number, actually in Thailand. They were probably one of the first ones since the tsunami to realize that they can rebuild their reefs. I know of at least 3 in that country. And Vietnam right now is looking to start a program of awareness of more sustainable aquaculture and maybe even coral restoration. There's a lot of other places on the islands in Indonesia and in the Indian Ocean as well that are doing something in the southeast part of the Pacific.
A question from Robert Keeley. How best to engage business and government leadership to support coral restoration efforts?
Yes, good question. Thank you. And, there's 2 ways you can do this. You can do it through private foundations, which is what we're doing. And then you could do it through, government organizations. we have a number of organizations, including, like NOAA and the National Marine Sanctuary and Florida Fish and Wildlife and all of those types of things that, can be implementing programs. Your input of how to influence what programs should be done is very, very important. And then, of course, in private foundations, you can do so by being a volunteer. And you can also do so by voting with your pocketbook. You can help support, in some cases, it doesn't have to be large numbers, but if you committed, like you see on TV ads, just $1 a day and just sent a check, $30 every month, or committed that to an organization that is your favorite, it would do great. There's plenty of good nonprofit organizations out there. You can do your homework to see which ones are putting the most amount of theirs into operational rather than administrational dollars, and try to get a better bang for your buck. But we shouldn't argue between the foundations of which one is better. We should just get them all to be funded and float all ships.
Okay, we've got another question. How much do the units cost? Wondering what I would be asking someone to donate so we could get a unit at our school. I think after that, we've got room for one more question.
Oh, that's a very good question. We're just in the beginning of these. And again, as I said before, most people visiting a large government facility or university or nonprofit research organization sees a multi-million-dollar facility, and it's not that. It's literally over $100,000, depending on what the needs are and the size. Our units that produce about 10,000 corals go for about $150,000 with some solar power included, to be partially at least off grid. So we're also not part of the problem. We're part of the cause. And so that's $15 a coral. $15 a coral to capitalize a system is lower than what most restoration other entities charge for a coral. But that unit will do that every single year. And then we can make bigger ones for a bigger impact. You can make one with 25 tanks that would produce 50,000 corals in case you want to make a bigger impact or involve a lot more people. And then there's even a larger one that will do about 100,000 corals a year. So that unit will in 10 years produce its own million. Thank you for that question.
Well, we don't have any more active questions in the Q&A or in the chat, but if you could direct people to our website, as well as maybe mention about our book for anyone that's interested in learning more about coral restoration.
Yeah, good point. The Plant a Million Corals, if you just type that in, you'll find it, but it's Plant a Million Corals Foundation.org. Just like it says, it's not just a funny name. It's our mission, it's our vision, and it's the recipe. And yes, if you go on those, we will soon be posting the link to a new book that my fellow restoration scientists and practitioners helped put together this year. We put together a 500-page book called Active Coral Restoration: New Technologies for a Changing Planet, just like we talked before. And it's got 500 pages of text of each section of coral restoration and how it's done. And it has 11 different case studies from around the world, from those who can show what worked and what didn't work in their country or their island. And then it even gives some tips at the end of where we think we're going in the future, as well as some online data sheets, if you are a practitioner, of how to take good environmental data and how to record good growth of your corals, etc. So we can track to see if temperature or pH and those climatic conditions, how they're improving or how they're affecting our corals and which corals are doing better. It's a scenario that a number of people ask me, questions about this, that it's not that hard. Once the hardest part is building and designing the systems, and all that work is done for you. What is easy is transferring this technology in just a couple of days to any individual and to communities to how to do that. So I like, with a little bit of comedy, saying this isn't rocket science. However, I also say that since we cut these corals, these living rocks, into little tiny pieces, it is rocket science, or micro rock science. And it's easily teachable, it's easily transferable. And I'm sure we will look at the technology that we're building today in the future as being something archaic. So I'm counting on all those innovative people out there, whether you're a retired engineer or biologist or teacher, or whether you're an aspiring student and have some ideas, to let's work on this planet. We know we have to stop climate change, but we also need to save the organisms along the way. So once we do hopefully solve climate change and have a better planet, there is no plan B planet as far as I'm concerned. Let's keep the one we've got and give people the hope that it's not all doom and gloom. The answer is in everybody's hands to change it one person at a time and one coral at a time. You know, some people ask me, and I'll leave it with this, is how much is it really going to cost us to save the corals all around the world? And I have to ask them a question back. How much will it cost if we don't restore the corals? And with that, I'd like to thank you for attending, and sorry about if we had any glitches with some of the slides. And thank you, my assistant Dee Dee, for picking up the pieces there. And thank you for the Climate Change Conference for being able to host this. And thank you for the Volo Foundation for allowing us to be a part of it. And with that, I'll see you on our website, or I'll see you out on the water, or I'll see you at your coral restoration site for your next coral lab. Thank you and goodbye.